Hey everyone, I noticed a lot of you who are watching and enjoying the content aren't subscribed yet. If you love spine-chilling stories, creepy encounters, and unexplained mysteries, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss out on the next terrifying upload. It really helps the channel grow and lets me keep bringing you more of the content you love. It was a Thursday evening when I met her, Sydney. I didn't know what I was expecting, but when I saw her walk into that coffee shop, I felt like time stopped. You know that feeling when everything around you kind of blurs, and the only thing in focus is the person standing in front of you? That's what it was like. I'd been talking to her online for a few weeks before we finally decided to meet in person. It was one of those blind dates set up through a mutual friend. I wasn't expecting much. I had been on my fair share of terrible blind dates, and this felt like it was going to be just another one of those awkward, forced conversations with no real connection. But Sydney was different. She had this energy about her, this warmth that made her instantly likable. She was funny, confident, and just easy to talk to. Within minutes, I felt comfortable in her presence. It wasn't like those other dates where you feel like you have to keep the conversation going just for the sake of it. With her, it was effortless. The way she laughed, the way her eyes sparkled when she talked about her favorite books or the movies she loved, it was contagious. I couldn't stop smiling. We talked about everything. Movies, music, our jobs, random stories from our childhoods. There was this instant connection, this feeling like we were on the same wavelength. She was down to earth, witty, and completely captivating. I was hooked. But as the night wore on, there was something I couldn't shake. It wasn't something obvious, more like a nagging feeling that I just couldn't put my finger on. Sydney was perfect. She was funny, charming, and seemed so real. But there were gaps. Little things she would say or avoid saying that made me wonder if there was more to her than what she let on. For example, when the topic of family came up, she always steered the conversation away. She'd laugh it off or joke about how dysfunctional her family was, but there was a nervousness in her voice that didn't quite match the words. When I mentioned my parents or my brothers, I could see her eyes flicker for a second, like a momentary sadness she quickly buried. I told myself not to push it. People had their reasons for keeping parts of their lives private. Maybe she just didn't want to talk about it. But there was something about the way she avoided certain topics that made me feel like there was more to her past than she was letting on. I wasn't sure what it was, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was only getting a tiny piece of the story. Over the next few weeks, Sydney and I went on several more dates. Each time she was the same, warm, funny, and charming. We hung out at coffee shops, went for walks in the park, and grabbed dinner at local restaurants. Each time I saw her, I felt more drawn to her. We had a connection, something real. Something I hadn't experienced in a long time. But still, there was that feeling, that nagging sense that she was hiding something from me. I tried not to think about it too much. Maybe I was overanalyzing things. Maybe I just wasn't used to feeling this comfortable with someone. But every time I looked at her, I kept seeing the cracks, the brief moments when she would slip up, the slight tension in her eyes when certain topics came up. It all came to a head one night. I had been talking to her for weeks, and I still didn't know much about her past. So, I did something I never thought I would do. I Googled her. I ran a reverse image search on one of her photos. I told myself it was just out of curiosity. I just wanted to know more about her. But what I found made my stomach drop. The search results brought up an obituary. At first, I thought I had to be seeing things. I clicked the link, unsure of what I was about to read. The obituary was for a woman named Sydney Taylor. The same face, the same smile, the same eyes. It said she had died 5 years ago in a car accident. My heart skipped a beat. There was no way this could be real, right? I must have been mistaken. Maybe it was a coincidence, someone with the same name, someone who looked like her. But as I dug deeper, it all became clear. The obituary was real. Her face was in it. I sat there in disbelief. I felt like I had just uncovered a terrible secret. How was it possible that the woman sitting across from me, the woman I had been spending all this time with, was the same woman in that obituary? It didn't make sense. I spent the rest of the night in a haze, unable to stop thinking about what I had found. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, Sydney's face, staring back at me from the screen. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe there was some explanation. Maybe it was a case of mistaken identity, or maybe she had faked her own death for some crazy reason. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized that whatever explanation I came up with, it didn't make sense. The next day, I met her for coffee again. The entire time, I couldn't focus on anything she was saying. My mind kept going back to the obituary, to the name, to the face. She smiled and laughed, talking about her work and her plans for the weekend, but I couldn't pay attention. I was too busy trying to piece together what was going on. I kept asking myself if I should confront her. Should I bring it up? Should I tell her I found out the truth? But every time I looked at her, I found myself hesitating. I wanted to trust her. I wanted to believe that this wasn't as strange as it seemed, but I couldn't. The evidence was right in front of me. Later that night, I found myself pacing in my apartment, debating what to do. I knew something was wrong. I had to get to the bottom of it. So I decided to dig deeper. I went back to the obituary, searched for any more details, anything that could explain what was going on. The more I searched, the more I found. Articles, old social media posts, memorial pages, all pointing to the same thing. Sydney Taylor had died 5 years ago. That's when I started to lose my grip on reality. How was she here, alive and well, sitting across from me, acting like nothing was wrong? It didn't make sense. I felt like I was losing my mind. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know the truth. So I called her. I told her I needed to talk, that something was off, that I had to ask her about her past. She agreed, but when I arrived at her apartment, everything felt different. There was a strange tension in the air, like she knew what I was going to ask before I even said it. Her apartment was exactly how I remembered it. Clean, organized, almost too perfect. The shelves were lined with books I had read, and the walls were adorned with artwork that felt like it belonged in a gallery. But there was a chill in the air now. Something was off. I asked her again about her past, about her family, about where she grew up, and that's when she froze. Her eyes flickered for a moment, and I could see the facade crack. It was just a split second, but it was enough for me to see the truth. She had been hiding something. I didn't know what, but I knew she wasn't telling me everything. I turned to leave, but as I moved toward the door, she stopped me. She said my name, but there was something different in her voice. It wasn't the warm, comforting voice I had come to know. It was cold, distant, like she was, not her. I don't know how to explain it, but everything inside me screamed that I had to get out of there. I didn't wait to ask her any more questions. I didn't need to. The truth had already revealed itself, and I wasn't sticking around to find out what she was hiding. I left. I didn't look back. I don't know what happened after that. Sydney's face still pops into my head from time to time. I try to shake it off, but the image of her sitting there, the coldness in her eyes, stays with me. I can't forget the way her smile flickered for just a second before it went back to that perfect, warm expression. I haven't tried to contact her. I haven't searched for her online anymore. There's nothing left to find, but there's something that haunts me to this day, something I can't shake. Sydney wasn't just avoiding her past. She was hiding from it. She was pretending to be someone she wasn't, someone who was dead, and I'm not sure if I'll ever understand what that means. I don't know if I want to. I can't keep thinking about it. Some mysteries are better left unsolved, right? Some things are just too dark to fully comprehend. Maybe I was right to leave. Maybe she wasn't just a woman I met on a blind date. Maybe she was something else entirely, something I wasn't meant to figure out. All I know is this: I never saw her again. I don't think I want to. It was supposed to be just a normal blind date, the kind of thing you do when you're single, when your friends think you should meet someone new, and when you're willing to give something a shot even though you're not really expecting much. You know the type, casual, low pressure. You show up, you talk, maybe you'll hit it off, maybe you won't. That's what I thought I was in for when Jane, my friend of a few years, set me up with Mark. The whole idea came about in one of those awkward, let's get you back out there conversations. Jane had noticed I hadn't been on a date in ages and thought I needed to get out of my shell. We talked about it casually over a cup of coffee one morning, and it was no big deal at first. But the next thing I knew, she was telling me about Mark, her friend from work, someone she said was really nice and super sweet. He was a little shy, a little quiet, but had the potential to be a great guy once you got to know him. I was skeptical, but I didn't have a ton of other options, so I agreed. She set up the date for a Friday night at a small Italian restaurant near the center of town. Cozy, nothing fancy. The texting before the date was normal, nothing too exciting. He asked about the usual stuff, what kind of food I liked, how my week had been. I asked if he'd been on many blind dates before, and he said he hadn't, which, honestly, made me feel a little better. It was nice to know I wasn't the only one walking into this thing a little uncertain. The night of the date, I was actually feeling a little nervous, but I told myself it was no big deal. The restaurant was just 5 minutes from my apartment, and I left a little early to make sure I wasn't rushing. It was a warm evening, the kind of early fall night when the air feels crisp but not too cold. As I parked and walked up to the entrance, I thought, okay, this could be fun. I was trying to shake off the nerves. Maybe I'd get some good food, maybe meet a decent guy. Worst case, I could just chalk it up to a funny story and move on. When I got inside, I gave the hostess my name, and she showed me to a small table near the window. The restaurant had that dim, cozy lighting, with flickering candles on each table, and it smelled amazing. It wasn't too crowded yet, so it felt like a relaxed atmosphere. I sat down, put my phone away, and looked around, trying to relax. My mind wandered to the usual date thoughts. What was Mark going to be like? Would we click? Would he be easy to talk to, or would I be counting down the minutes until I could leave? Minutes passed. No Mark. I didn't think too much of it at first. Maybe he was running late. It happens, right? I checked my phone. No message from him. Maybe he had gotten caught in traffic. I tried to distract myself with the menu, looking over the list of pastas and wines they offered. Still no Mark. The waiter came by to ask if I was ready to order, but I told him I was still waiting. He's probably on his way, I said with a forced smile. The waiter nodded and walked away, leaving me sitting there, my fingers nervously tapping the table. It wasn't like I was in a rush, but I was starting to get the feeling that maybe something wasn't quite right. I checked my phone again, still no text from Mark. At this point, I started wondering if I had misread the time. Maybe I'd gotten it wrong, though I knew I hadn't. It was, exactly. I looked around the restaurant, trying to see if anyone who looked like him was walking in. Nothing. I was starting to feel frustrated. I texted Jane, "Hey, I'm at the restaurant, but Mark still hasn't shown up. Any idea where he is?" I waited a few minutes. Nothing. I looked around the restaurant again. The hostess had shown a couple of people to their tables, but no one had looked like Mark. I even asked the waiter, just to make sure, "Are there any reservations for a Mark tonight?" He looked through the book and said, "No, I don't see anyone by that name." "Sorry." I nodded, though I was starting to feel like this was all wrong. By now, I was feeling a little embarrassed. I had spent the last 20 minutes sitting at a table by myself while everyone else seemed to have someone to dine with. I checked my phone again. Still nothing. Bye. I was about to text Jane again, but then something weird happened. I remembered something that made my stomach twist. I'd been talking to Jane just a few days before about Mark. I asked her about him, what he was like, what kind of person he was, but she didn't tell me much. She'd said he was shy and maybe a little introverted, but was really sweet once you got to know him. That was it. That was all I knew about him. But now that I thought about it, that didn't seem right. It was like she'd told me just enough to sound normal, but had never gone into detail. I couldn't remember any specifics, where he worked, what he liked to do outside of his job, where he grew up. Nothing. I was about to send Jane another message when I felt a weird sense of unease settle in. It wasn't just about Mark anymore. It was about everything. I picked up my phone and opened the text thread with Jane. That's when I saw it. I had a new message from her, but it wasn't what I was expecting. "Wait, what are you talking about? I never set you up with anyone." I stared at the text for a long time, not quite believing what I was reading. I read it again and again. My heart started racing as I thought about how wrong everything felt. What did she mean she hadn't set me up with anyone? Of course she had. She was the one who gave me Mark's number. She was the one who made the plan. I shook my head, trying to make sense of it. Maybe she was joking. Maybe she'd forgotten. But why would she joke about something like this? My fingers moved quickly as I typed out a response. I didn't even know what to say, but I just had to know what the hell was going on. "What do you mean?" "You set me up with Mark. You gave me his number and everything. You told me about him." But as soon as I sent it, I realized something that made my stomach drop. I had already been talking to Mark. I'd gotten texts from him. We had exchanged messages about meeting up, about the time and the place. I didn't imagine any of that, did I? I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. I didn't know what was happening. I stood up from the table, feeling my hands tremble. I was shaking now, a mix of confusion and growing dread creeping in. Something wasn't right. I left the restaurant, walking quickly toward my car. I couldn't stay there. I couldn't sit in that weird, empty restaurant waiting for a man who wasn't even real. As I stepped outside into the cool night air, I glanced at my phone. Still no reply from Jane. I got into my car, my mind racing, trying to make sense of everything. Maybe this was some elaborate prank? Maybe Mark was never real, and Jane had been toying with me the whole time. But why? Why would she do that? I pulled out of the parking lot, still trying to figure it out. The world felt off now, like everything was out of place. I didn't know where I was going, but I couldn't stop driving. I didn't want to go home just yet, not when everything felt so strange. I needed to clear my head. As I drove through the quiet streets, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. I glanced at the rearview mirror and saw nothing, but the feeling lingered. It was as if someone was behind me, just out of view. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like I had to look again. And when I did, I saw something, a figure. It wasn't clear at first, just a silhouette standing by the side of the road. It was too dark to make out details, but I could see a person standing there. My heart skipped. It couldn't be Mark, could it? But when I turned my head to look again, there was nothing. The figure was gone. I don't know what happened after that. I just know I drove home in a daze, my head spinning. I haven't been able to talk to Jane since. I called her, but she never answered. I texted her, and it's like she disappeared off the face of the earth. Maybe it was all just a coincidence. Maybe it was some weird mix-up. But that night, something happened, and I can't explain it. There's a part of me that wonders if I'll ever know the truth. All I know is this: I was set up with someone who didn't exist, and it's something I can't shake. Something is wrong. Something's out there, and I can't stop thinking about it. I don't even want to go back to that place. I don't want to ask any more questions. But I can't stop myself from wondering who or what was really waiting for me that night. I don't know if it was fate, coincidence, or something else entirely, but looking back on it, I can't shake the feeling that the universe was playing some twisted game with me. It all started on a Friday night, just like any other. I was sitting at the bar of a fairly quiet pub, nursing a drink, trying to unwind after a long work week. The usual crowd was there. Guys chatting with each other, a couple on a date, some guy at the jukebox playing terrible 80s hits. Nothing out of the ordinary. I had been on a few dates here, nothing to write home about. Just the usual awkwardness of small talk and figuring out whether you really have anything in common with a complete stranger. But tonight? Well, tonight was supposed to be different. Or so I thought. I had been set up with someone. A blind date, courtesy of a friend of a friend. Her name was Lisa. We didn't talk too much before meeting, but from what I could gather, she seemed nice. The plan was simple: meet up, grab a drink, see if there was any chemistry. Nothing serious, just a casual night. I wasn't expecting fireworks, just hoping for a decent conversation and maybe a good time. The place wasn't packed, and I showed up early, taking a seat at the bar and waiting for her. About 10 minutes in, I felt my phone buzz in my pocket. I pulled it out and saw a message from her. She was running a little late, no big deal, I figured. So I sat back and ordered another drink, starting to get a little anxious because, honestly, blind dates are always a bit nerve-wracking. Around minutes later, she walked in. I knew it was her right away, partly because she had sent me a picture earlier, but mostly because of the way she held herself. Confident, casual, but there was something different about her, something almost off. But at the time, I didn't really think too much about it. She walked up to the bar, gave me a smile, and we exchanged introductions. Lisa was beautiful in a way that didn't scream for attention, but made you notice her once you really looked. She had dark brown hair that fell just past her shoulders, a soft, easy smile, and a relaxed but confident vibe. We sat down and started chatting. The usual small talk at first, what we did for work, where we grew up, stuff like that. But there was something strange about her. It wasn't her looks or anything she said, but more the way she said things. She'd smile and laugh at the right moments, but there was a certain nervousness behind her eyes, like she was trying to convince herself to be calm, even though she was obviously anything but. We talked about a few random things: music, movies, our favorite spots in town. But after about 30 minutes, I noticed something weird. She was getting more anxious. I couldn't place it, but I could see the tension building in her. Her hand was tapping on the bar, and she kept glancing around like she was looking for something, or someone. I wasn't sure, but I had this strange feeling in my gut, like something wasn't quite right. And then, out of nowhere, she said something that froze me in my tracks. "It's happening again," she said, her voice trembling. I looked at her, trying to figure out if she was joking, but the look in her eyes wasn't one of humor. It was pure panic. She grabbed the glass in front of her, almost knocking it over as she set it down. I asked her what she meant, but before I could even get the words out, she looked at me like she had just seen a ghost. "Listen, I don't know how to explain this, but you need to leave. Right now. You're about to die." I froze. At first, I thought she was messing with me, some weird joke or prank, but her expression, the way she was holding herself, told me she was dead serious. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with fear, and for the first time, I could see the real fear behind her facade. I opened my mouth to say something, but the words died in my throat. It felt like I was suffocating, like the air had suddenly gotten thick. My brain was scrambling to catch up. What was going on? Was she drunk? Was this some weird emotional outburst? But before I could ask anything, everything around me went dark. Like a switch had been flipped. and the whole room was swallowed in blackness. I couldn't see, couldn't hear. The world was just gone. And then, as quickly as it had all disappeared, I found myself back at home. I woke up in my bed the next morning, drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. My head was spinning, like I had just woken up from some kind of bizarre, restless dream. I looked around, trying to ground myself. The room was exactly how I'd left it, nothing out of the ordinary. But something felt wrong. My stomach churned with a sense of dread that I couldn't shake. I glanced at the time. 7 p.m. My heart skipped a beat. It was the same time as when I had gone to bed last night. I got up, rubbed my face, and looked at myself in the mirror. Something was wrong. I was getting ready for the date again. At first, I thought I was just still half asleep. Maybe it was just a weird, vivid dream. But as I went through the motions of getting dressed, brushing my teeth, and heading out the door, I realized I was doing everything exactly the same as I had done the night before. I had no memory of how the night ended. I was going through the motions without even realizing it. It was as if the whole thing had been a loop, an event repeating itself. The weirdest part? I couldn't shake the sense of déjà vu. I'd been here before. I'd done all of this before. The bar, the seat, the drink, it all felt like a dream I had somehow forgotten until now. I didn't know what to think. I had to go to the bar. I had to meet her again. Maybe I could stop whatever was going to happen. Maybe if I could somehow make it right, I wouldn't have to relive whatever was about to happen. I drove back to the same pub, the same parking lot, the same streetlights, but everything felt strange. Like I was trapped in a moment that I couldn't escape. I walked into the bar, and there she was, sitting at the same spot at the counter, looking almost exactly the same as the night before. I didn't want to sit down again. I didn't want to go through this whole thing a second time. But my legs moved on their own, pulling me toward her like I had no control. When she saw me, her face changed. A look of recognition flashed in her eyes, but it wasn't relief. It was fear. And then she said it again. It's happening again. Her voice shook. My heart raced. It was like déjà vu, but not the kind you want. The kind where you know something bad is coming, and you can't stop it. And that's when it hit me. I was stuck. Stuck in the same night. I couldn't stop it. I couldn't change it. I was about to relive the same events over and over again, and this time I wasn't sure I would make it out alive. I don't remember much after that. The darkness came again and I was back home, but this time I knew. I knew that the cycle was going to keep happening, over and over. And the worst part? I didn't know how to break it. I don't know what's going on, but I know one thing for sure, something is coming. Something that will keep me trapped in this nightmare, repeating the same night over and over until I find a way to stop it, or until it finally takes me. I keep waking up every time, getting ready for the same date, and each time I see her face, her terrified eyes, and hear her whispering those words, it's happening again. But no matter what I do, no matter how hard I try to escape, I'm stuck. Each time I try to change the outcome, each time I think I've figured it out, the loop starts all over again. This night is never ending, and I don't know how much longer I can keep going. The only thing I can do now is wait. Wait until the next cycle. Maybe one day I'll break free. Maybe I'll finally wake up in a world where the date doesn't repeat itself. But for now, all I can do is wonder, what is waiting for me at the end of this twisted loop? The thing about blind dates is that you never really know what to expect. You're thrown into this situation with a complete stranger and have to make the best of it, right? That's how I felt when I was set up with Jessica. We'd exchanged a few texts before, nothing that stood out as weird. She seemed normal enough, just a girl trying to meet someone new, and I was on board for that. It was supposed to be simple, dinner, drinks, see if there was chemistry. That's all. I met her at this little Italian place downtown, one of those cozy spots with dim lighting, the smell of garlic and fresh bread wafting through the air. Perfect for a date, I thought. When I walked in, I immediately spotted her. She was sitting at the corner booth looking around, checking her phone. She wasn't exactly what I expected. Not in a bad way, just a little different. She looked nervous, but then again, I guess I was too. We greeted each other, and she smiled as I slid into the booth. We had a couple of drinks, the usual small talk. We talked about work, our hobbies, the places we'd been. But there was something off. I couldn't put my finger on it at first. She wasn't overly anxious, but there was this weird undercurrent to the conversation, like she was holding something back. After dinner, we decided to have a drink at the bar. I thought maybe that would help the vibe loosen up a bit, make things feel less forced. The bartender brought over 2 glasses of whiskey, and we clinked them together. That's when things started to feel strange. She'd been acting fine up until then, but all of a sudden she got quiet. Her eyes darted around the bar, then she stood up quickly. "I need to use the restroom," she said. I didn't think anything of it, but the second she stood up, I felt like something was off. Something about the way she moved, too quickly, too stiff, like she was trying to escape her own skin. I didn't even know how to describe it at the time. I sat there, swirling my drink, feeling the buzz of the alcohol settling in. I glanced over at the mirror behind the bar, and for a second I thought I saw her reflection, but not how I expected. It wasn't just her, it was something else. The reflection of the bar was distorted in a way that I couldn't explain. It felt like everything in the room had warped, just a little bit, but enough for me to feel uneasy. I shrugged it off. I was probably just drunker than I thought. So I finished my drink and waited, but then about 5 minutes later, Jessica came back from the restroom. She looked fine, like nothing had happened, but there was something different in her eyes, something unsettled. She didn't sit back down right away. Instead, she paused by the bathroom door, staring at the mirror. I watched her in the reflection. Her face seemed wrong. It wasn't her usual calm expression. She looked kind of frantic, almost afraid. She raised her hand, running it through her hair, like she was trying to fix it. I couldn't see much, but I saw enough to notice how her eyes were glued to the mirror. It was almost like she was looking at something, or someone behind her. I was about to get up, but then I saw it. Her reflection, staring right back at her, was smiling. But Jessica wasn't. She looked like she was about to freak out. And her reflection, it just kept smiling. I felt a cold, creeping sensation crawl up my spine, but I stayed frozen in my seat. Maybe it was just the lighting, maybe it was some weird optical illusion, but it didn't feel right. The reflection's smile stretched wider, more sinister, as if it had a life of its own. Jessica didn't notice at first. She was still focused on fixing her hair, her eyes locked on the mirror, but the longer she stood there, the more I noticed how everything felt off. Like time had slowed down just for us. My heart raced, and I could barely breathe, just watching as her reflection continued to smile, that grin growing wider. She finally turned around to look at me, her face still not showing any sign of that strange fear that had gripped her just moments earlier. The second she turned, the smile in the mirror vanished. The reflection returned to a neutral expression, just like hers. She walked back to the table, sitting down like nothing happened. But I couldn't let it go. I couldn't stop thinking about it. It felt wrong. I tried to play it cool, but my mind kept racing. I was struggling to figure out what just happened, but I didn't want to seem like some paranoid freak. I didn't want to make her uncomfortable, especially when she hadn't seemed to notice what I'd seen. So I tried to ignore it, but I couldn't. By the time we finished our drinks and the check came, I felt like I had to know. I had to ask her if she'd seen something too, but I couldn't bring myself to say it out loud. We left the bar and walked outside. The cool night air hit my face, and the unease I'd been feeling started to dissipate, replaced by the tension that had built up in me during the entire night. I walked her to her car, my footsteps quick on the pavement. The streetlights above us flickered as I held the door open for her, but before she got in, she stopped. She looked over her shoulder, back at the building, and for a second, I thought she was looking at the mirror in the bar again. But she wasn't. She was staring at the reflection of the streetlight on the ground, her face pale, her eyes wide. I didn't know what to say. But I saw it then, the smallest crack of fear in her expression. It was brief, but I saw it. "Are you okay?" I asked. Her lips parted, but she didn't answer right away. She just stood there for a moment, shaking her head slightly, like she was trying to shake off something she couldn't quite remember. She finally got in her car, started the engine and drove away, leaving me standing there alone, feeling like I'd just missed something important, something I couldn't quite figure out. I stood there, staring at the empty street, still feeling the cold creep of dread that hadn't left me. And then it hit me. Maybe I hadn't imagined what happened in the mirror. Maybe it wasn't just a trick of the light. Maybe something really was wrong. I never heard from her again. I tried calling a few times, but she never picked up. I sent her a couple of texts, just to check in, but she never responded. Maybe she was just busy, or maybe she wasn't interested anymore. But every time I thought about her, about that smile in the mirror, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever I saw wasn't just some weird coincidence. I tried to forget about the whole thing, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. Maybe she was caught in something she couldn't explain either. Maybe whatever was in that mirror followed her home. And as for me, I don't know if I'll ever really understand what happened that night, but I'll never forget the smile in the mirror, the smile that wasn't hers. And now, whenever I pass a mirror, I always double-check to make sure there's no one standing behind me, just in case. I've always been skeptical of blind dates, It's not like I'm opposed to meeting new people, but there's something about the idea of being set up that just feels off. But when my friend Julia insisted I go out with a guy she knew, I figured, why not? I hadn't been on a date in a while, and honestly, I was bored. So, I agreed. I don't really remember much about what I was expecting. I just knew it was going to be dinner at some fancy little Italian place. Nothing too crazy. When I arrived at the restaurant, I didn't see anyone waiting for me. The place was packed, and I figured he was running late or something. I wasn't too bothered. I grabbed a seat at the bar, ordered a drink, and settled in to check my phone. Minutes ticked by, and I was starting to feel a little annoyed. My drink was long gone, and I hadn't heard a word from him. So I texted Julia, figuring she might have some clue about what was going on. She texted me back right away. I don't know why I didn't think of this earlier, but I asked if she had the right guy. "Oh yeah, his name's Dan. He should be there soon," she replied. But Dan never showed. I waited for a while longer before texting Julia again. I asked her if she was sure he was coming. I got a response that made my stomach flip. "Wait, what are you talking about? I never set you up with anyone." I froze. At first, I thought it was a joke. Maybe she was messing with me. I mean, it didn't make sense. We had talked about this a few days ago. She had even given me his number. So why was she acting like she had no idea who I was talking about? I stared at my phone for a while, letting the screen light flicker in the dim bar. I thought I was just tired or something. Maybe I was reading too much into it. But something about the message didn't sit right. I had no idea what was happening, but I knew I had to get out of there. I stood up, took a deep breath, and left the restaurant. It was late, way later than I'd planned, and I felt weird. The kind of weird that makes your skin crawl. I pulled my jacket tighter around myself as I walked down the street, trying to push thoughts of Julia's message out of my head. The night air was cold, and I figured I could just grab a cab home and forget about the whole thing. But then, out of nowhere, I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around, half expecting to see someone I knew, but there was nobody there. Just an empty street, a few lights flickering in the distance. For a second, I thought I might have imagined it. But then I heard the footsteps again. Closer this time. I felt my heart skip a beat as I quickened my pace. Whoever it was, they were following me. I glanced over my shoulder one last time. A figure was there, standing under a streetlight, just far enough away that I couldn't make out their face. But the moment I looked back, they disappeared into the shadows. That's when I realized something. It was like the whole evening had been one long, weird blur. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Maybe I had just overthought everything. The whole blind date, Julia's strange response, the footsteps. I told myself it was all in my head. When I got home, I tried to relax. The feeling didn't go away. I sat on my couch for a while, replaying the night in my mind, but nothing added up. Maybe Dan was a no-show. Maybe Julia had forgotten about the setup. It wasn't a huge deal. I'd get over it. But the weirdest thing happened the next day. I got a text from Julia. She apologized and said she had messed up, that she had set me up with someone. But then, get this, she realized he'd moved out of town and wouldn't be able to make it. At first, I thought she was just trying to cover her tracks, but something about her message felt forced, like she was trying to convince me everything was fine, when clearly it wasn't. I asked her more questions, but the answers were vague, like she was avoiding giving me any specifics. I dropped it for a while, figuring maybe I'd misinterpreted something or that I was just in a weird headspace. But over the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I started thinking about my date, that weird restaurant, that uncomfortable silence when Dan didn't show, and Julia's odd response. It was like the pieces weren't fitting together. That's when I decided to do some digging. I went through my phone, looking at the old messages with Julia. I found her initial message introducing me to Dan, with his number attached. I still had the number saved, and without thinking too much about it, I called him. The phone rang for a while before it went to voicemail. The voicemail wasn't Dan's. It was someone else. Someone I didn't recognize, but their voice sounded strangely familiar. I was already on edge, but hearing that voicemail pushed me even further. I hung up quickly, trying to rationalize what was happening. But I had to know. I went back to the restaurant where we were supposed to meet. I thought maybe I'd ask the staff, see if anyone remembered a man named Dan coming in. Maybe they'd know something I didn't. When I walked in, the hostess greeted me. I asked her if she remembered a guy named Dan coming in last week for a date. She looked at me like I was crazy. "Sorry, we don't have anyone named Dan on record," she said. I could feel the blood drain from my face. I asked her to check the reservation book, but she just shook her head, confused. "I'm sorry, there's no reservation for anyone named Dan." I left the restaurant. the uneasy feeling I had been ignoring now growing into full-blown anxiety. What was going on? How was none of this real? Why couldn't I find anything about him? I drove home that night, my mind racing. When I walked into my apartment, I went straight to my couch and sat down. Everything felt wrong. The whole day, everything had felt off, like I was living in a parallel version of reality where things just didn't make sense. That's when I got another text from Julia. She asked how I was doing, if everything was all right. I stared at her message for a long time before typing something back. I asked her if she remembered anything about the date, anything at all, and why no one seemed to know Dan. She responded quickly, but this time, there was something different in her tone. I told you I didn't set you up with anyone. That was the last message I got from her. I never heard from Julia again. I tried calling her, texting her, everything, but there was nothing, no response. And to this day, I haven't heard from her. Now, I can't shake the feeling that someone is watching me. It's like my whole life has been, erased or replaced by something I can't explain. I can't even find the restaurant I went to. It's like it was never there. And sometimes, late at night, I hear footsteps. And sometimes I think I see him, Dan or whatever he really is, standing under the streetlight waiting. It was one of those random blind dates that didn't seem like it would amount to much, but I agreed because, well, I'd been pushing myself to get out more. A friend of a friend, someone I'd never met, had set me up. "You'll like him," she said. "He's quiet but nice. Nothing too intense, right? A casual dinner, a chance to meet someone new." The restaurant was cozy, not too fancy, but still had a nice vibe to it. It was one of those places where you can hear the murmur of conversation, the clink of glass, and the low hum of the kitchen. I was early, which was typical for me. I didn't mind, though. It gave me a chance to settle in and scroll through my phone for a bit. I had no idea what to expect, but I hoped he was someone I could at least have a decent conversation with. When he walked in, I noticed him right away. He was tall, dark-haired, and had a pretty easygoing look about him. He didn't look like anyone I knew, which felt comforting. A blank slate. He smiled at me as he approached, and we exchanged a quick handshake before sitting down at the table. Everything started off normal enough. For the first few minutes, we talked about the usual stuff, work, hobbies, the weather, nothing groundbreaking. Then, as we moved on to more random topics, he asked me if I had any weird dreams. I'm not sure why, but the question threw me off a little. I was a bit of an open book when it came to things like that, so I decided to answer honestly. I told him about a recurring nightmare I'd had for years. It was always the same. I was walking through an abandoned house, old wooden floors, broken windows, dust everywhere. The air was thick, and I could hear my footsteps echoing in the silence. But I never saw anyone. Still, I knew something was there, watching, waiting. I'd always wake up right when I was about to turn a corner, never knowing who or what it was. His expression changed when I said it. He stopped chewing for a second and looked at me like I'd just said something strange. I brushed it off, thinking maybe it was just an odd story to share on a first date. But then, after a long pause, he did something I didn't expect. He leaned back in his chair and said he had the same dream. At first, I thought he was just messing with me, making a joke. But as he went on, he started describing the dream in eerie detail. He said he also wandered through a crumbling house, but in his version, it was even worse. The shadows seemed darker, the walls felt like they were closing in. And the worst part, he was being watched by something in those shadows. And then, he said something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. "In my dream, I see you." I don't know why, but I felt this cold wave of unease wash over me. I thought it was just a weird coincidence at first. But as I looked at his face, his pale expression, I could tell he wasn't joking. He was serious. He wasn't just saying this for shock value. He was believing it. His hands were shaking slightly as he took a sip of his drink. I didn't know what to say. I thought maybe it was a weird fluke, like some sort of freaky mind trick, but deep down, something felt off. We kept talking after that, but the whole conversation felt strange. I tried to shake the feeling off, but it kept gnawing at me. I don't remember the rest of the dinner. I don't even remember how we said goodbye. I guess I just wanted to get out of there. When I walked outside, I took a deep breath, hoping the fresh air would clear my head, but it didn't. I kept replaying what he had said over and over. I didn't know if it was just a strange coincidence or something more sinister, but it bothered me. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized how real it had all felt. It wasn't just some vague conversation. There was something in his eyes that told me he wasn't lying. The same nightmare, the same house, and I was in it. I shook my head, telling myself I was being ridiculous. Maybe it was just a weird thing that happened between two strangers on a date. But then I realized something. If he really did have the same dream, How could that be possible? I mean, how many people have the same exact dream, right? Was there something more to it? I couldn't stop thinking about it. The idea of us both trapped in some dark, abandoned house, being watched by an unknown presence, haunted me. It was like that nightmare had spilled over into real life. I couldn't shake the feeling that the dream wasn't just some random thing. Maybe it meant something. Or maybe, just maybe, he had been lying to me to get some sort of reaction. But why lie about something so strange? I didn't want to be paranoid. I told myself that the night had just been weird and that I was overthinking everything. But over the next few days, things started to get even weirder. I couldn't stop thinking about the house in the dream. It kept popping into my head at the strangest times. As if I could almost picture it, like I had been there before. The broken windows, the dust in the air, the darkness in the corners. It felt so familiar, but I knew I had never been to a house like that in my life. But something about it felt so real, like it had been a place I'd been to 1,000 times before, even though I had never been there. The worst part was that every time I closed my eyes, I could see it clearer. I could see the door at the end of the hall, the one I was always too scared to open, the one I could never reach before I woke up. I started thinking about my date, about the way his face had looked when he told me he saw me in his dream. His expression was almost desperate, like he was trying to make me understand something. It felt like there was a connection between us, something deeper than just a shared nightmare, something that wasn't coincidence. I knew I had to get answers, so I decided to reach out to him. I found his number, sent him a message, but it took hours before he replied. When he did, it was a simple text. He apologized for the weirdness of the night and said he didn't want to scare me, but that wasn't the answer I needed. I wanted to know why he had seen me, why I was in his dream, but he never gave me an answer. The next day, I tried to call him, but his phone went straight to voicemail. After that, I couldn't get in touch with him again. His social media accounts went dark, and I never heard from him after that. The more I thought about it, the more I realized I wasn't sure I wanted to. There was something about that date, something about him, that felt wrong, like there was something I wasn't supposed to know. I didn't know if he was a part of my nightmare, or if my nightmare had somehow bled into reality. Either way, I knew one thing for sure. I didn't want to meet him in that house again. But the nightmares didn't stop. They only grew worse. The house was no longer a dream. It had become a place I couldn't escape, a place that was creeping into my waking life. I knew that house now, like I had always known it. And every time I closed my eyes, I saw him there. In the shadows, I was trapped. But in my dream, I couldn't escape. My friend had set me up with someone she swore I'd like. He's chill, a little quiet, but nice, she told me. It wasn't that I was dying to meet someone, but I was in one of those moods where I felt like getting out of my routine. A chance to meet someone new, eat some good food, nothing to lose. I showed up early, as I usually do. I like to arrive before the rush, take in the atmosphere, and just decompress a little. The restaurant was in a part of town I didn't visit often, tucked between some old shops with peeling paint and an air of decay. The outside looked ordinary enough, with its small sign and no real distinguishing features, but when I walked in, it felt different. The ambiance was like nothing I'd ever experienced before. The dim lighting came from hundreds of candles scattered across every surface, giving everything a soft golden hue. The air smelled faintly of incense, like someone had been burning something sweet. The walls were lined with dark wood, and the tables were set very close together, giving it an almost intimate feel, like a place that existed in its own little world. The hostess greeted me with a warm smile and led me to a small table tucked in the corner. The restaurant wasn't busy, but the air was full of this soft hum, like a mix of low conversation and the faint clink of silverware. It was cozy, almost too cozy, the kind of place that felt like it had secrets. I sat down, checked my phone for a message from my date, but there was nothing. I looked around again. There was no sign of him yet, and I had to admit, I was a little nervous. I wasn't sure what to expect. My friend had given me no real details, just that he was chill, which, if I'm being honest, felt more like an excuse for a lack of description than anything else. After a few minutes, the door opened, and in walked the man who I assumed was my date. He looked nothing like I expected. Tall, dark hair, well-dressed. He was handsome in a way that seemed calculated. He walked toward me with confidence, his eyes locking onto mine, and gave me a small smile as he sat down. I returned the smile, trying to appear relaxed, but something about the way he looked at me made me feel watched. The conversation started slow. We talked about the usual things, work, hobbies, where we grew up. He seemed pleasant enough, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something off about him. His responses were too perfect, too well thought out, like he'd rehearsed them in his head. Every word seemed intentional. And it wasn't just his speech. His gaze never wavered. He was always looking at me, like he was studying me, analyzing me with every word I said. I tried to brush it off as first date jitters. Maybe I was just overthinking it. He smiled at me, and I felt the tension ease just a little. The waitress brought our drinks, and we both settled into a more relaxed conversation. At least the food was good. The steak was perfectly cooked, and the side dishes were flavorful. But that feeling of unease didn't go away. It lingered in the back of my mind, creeping in during the lulls in conversation. I kept thinking about the way he stared at me, the way his smile never seemed to falter, even when there was a pause. It was like he was waiting for something, like he knew something I didn't. As we moved on to talk about more personal things, he asked if I had any recurring dreams. I thought it was a strange question, but I went along with it. I've always been someone who remembers their dreams, even the weird ones. So I told him about a nightmare I've had for years, one that always comes back to me, no matter how many times I tell myself it's just a dream. It's always the same. I'm walking through an old abandoned house, creaky wooden floors, peeling wallpaper, broken windows, and everything covered in a thick layer of dust. The air is thick and heavy, and I hear my footsteps echoing in the silence. I can't see anyone, but I know there's something in the house with me, something watching me, waiting for me to make a move. I never get to the end. I always wake up just as I'm about to turn a corner, never knowing who or what it is that's following me. I figured it was just an odd story to share on a first date. I didn't expect him to react the way he did. He went still, his face paling just slightly as I spoke. He didn't even take a sip of his wine. I almost stopped talking, unsure of why he was so quiet all of a sudden. But then he broke the silence, speaking in this slow, measured tone that sent a chill down my spine. He told me that he had the same dream, and not just that, it was the same house, the same dark, empty rooms. The only difference? He said he could see me. He told me that in his dream I was there, walking through the same house, exactly like I described. I thought maybe he was just trying to be dramatic, but the look on his face told me otherwise. He wasn't joking. He wasn't playing. He was serious. I tried to laugh it off, thinking it was just some bizarre coincidence. But as I looked into his eyes, I saw this flicker of something dark and uncertain, like he wasn't just telling a story. I didn't know how to respond. I kept looking at him, wondering if maybe this was some weird prank. But there was nothing funny about his expression. He wasn't looking at me the way someone looks at a date. It was more like he was staring through me, into something just beyond my reach. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I tried to move on, changing the subject, but it wasn't long before the atmosphere started to shift. The restaurant, which had been buzzing with soft chatter, had suddenly grown unnervingly quiet. The clink of silverware and glasses faded into this eerie stillness. I looked around. There were no new customers. The place, which had seemed full just moments ago, was now practically empty. The air felt heavy. I excused myself to the bathroom, hoping to clear my head, but when I tried to open the bathroom door, it wouldn't budge. I tried again, pushing harder, but it was like someone had locked it from the other side. I looked down the hall, but it was empty. The hallway felt longer than it had before, and the door at the end of the corridor was closed tight. I went back to my table, my stomach twisting with unease. I didn't know why I felt this way, but I had this nagging sense that something was wrong, something beyond just the weird coincidence of our shared nightmare. I stood up, ready to leave, but when I tried to go to the front door, I found it locked. I shook the handle, pulling with all my strength, but it wouldn't open. The restaurant was silent now, and there was no sign of the staff. I looked back at my date. He hadn't moved from his seat. His eyes met mine, and that same calm, detached look was still there, like he knew exactly what was happening. I asked him, somewhat frantically, what was going on, but he didn't answer. His lips just curled into that same serene smile, and he said something that made my blood run cold. "It's best if you just stay." I wanted to scream, to bang on the windows, to break down the door, but nothing worked. The entire restaurant felt like it was encasing me, trapping me in a place where escape wasn't possible. I don't know how much time passed, but eventually, I couldn't stay on my feet anymore. I collapsed back into my seat, too frightened to move, too confused to do anything but stare at my date, who was still sitting there, unmoved, unblinking. The next thing I remember is waking up in my bed, completely disoriented. I was home, but I couldn't remember how I got there. The restaurant, my date, it was like it all happened in a dream, but I knew it wasn't. I knew what I felt. The place, the quiet, the doors that wouldn't open. It wasn't just a nightmare. And now, every time I close my eyes, I can't shake the feeling that I'm still there, trapped in that restaurant, with no way out, just like before. It was one of those nights that started out like any other, a random blind date set up by a friend of a friend. I'd been meaning to push myself to get out more, so I agreed. The whole idea of meeting someone new felt kind of exciting, though I wasn't exactly expecting anything life-changing. My friend had told me he was nice and quiet, and that seemed harmless enough. The bar we were meeting at was casual, nothing too fancy or intimidating. I figured it would be a chill evening, some easy conversation, and who knows, maybe I'd even make a new friend. I arrived a little early, because that's just who I am. I like to settle in before things get started, and I'm not one to rush. The bar was cozy, dark, but welcoming, with soft jazz music playing in the background. It was one of those places where you could lose yourself in the low hum of conversations, clinking glasses, and the occasional burst of laughter from the corner booth. The bartender greeted me with a nod, and I ordered a drink while I waited. I was scrolling through my phone, not thinking too much about the date ahead. I kept looking up at the door, though, wondering who this guy was going to be. I had no idea what he looked like or anything about him, other than what my friend had told me. Maybe I was overthinking it, but I kept trying to picture the kind of person I was about to meet. When the door opened, I glanced up, and there he was, tall, dark-haired, and a little scruffy. He had a relaxed look, like someone who didn't care too much about appearances, which was fine by me. I mean, who wants to deal with someone who spends an hour getting ready, right? He made his way over to me, and I stood to greet him. He smiled, a little shyly, and extended his hand for a handshake. We sat down at a table by the window, and the first few minutes went like any other date. Small talk. What do you do for work? Hobbies? Music you like? The usual boring stuff. He was quiet, yes, but he had a kind enough vibe. Maybe he wasn't super chatty, but he wasn't making things awkward either. Still, there was something off. I couldn't place it, but it was like there was a little tension in the air. I shrugged it off. Maybe it was just the nerves. I was a little nervous too. After a while, the conversation shifted. He asked me a weird question, one I wasn't expecting. He asked if I'd ever had any strange dreams or nightmares. I didn't really know how to answer at first, but then I thought about it. I tend to be an open book with stuff like that. I figured, why not? I told him about this recurring nightmare I'd had for years. It was always the same. I'd find myself walking through this old abandoned house. Everything was decaying, wooden floors covered in dust, broken windows letting in streaks of moonlight. It always felt so real. The air was thick and heavy, and I could hear my own footsteps echoing in the silence. The worst part? I never saw anyone else. But I always felt like someone was watching me, waiting. Every time, just as I'd get to the end of the hallway ready to turn the corner, I'd wake up. I never made it around that corner, and it always left me with this unsettled feeling. As soon as I finished, I noticed him. His expression had changed. It wasn't what I expected. He looked pale, almost drained, and he didn't say anything for a long time. His hand froze mid-air as he lifted his glass to his lips. There was a moment of silence, a weird tension that settled between us. I thought maybe I'd said something weird, but then he broke the silence in a way that caught me completely off guard. He said he had the same dream. At first, I thought he was joking. I figured it was just some weird way to keep the conversation going. But as he described the dream in detail, my stomach sank. It was almost exactly the same as mine, except for one difference. His version was worse. He said the house felt like it was closing in on him. The shadows were darker, thicker. The air felt suffocating, and he was sure that something was there, lurking in those shadows just out of sight. And then came the part that made my skin crawl. He said, "In my dream, I see you." I couldn't move. I just stared at him. For a second, I thought maybe I had misheard him. But no, that's exactly what he said. He wasn't joking. His face was serious, his eyes wide. And that was when the unease hit me full force. Something wasn't right. I tried to brush it off, tell myself it was just one of those odd coincidences, but deep down I couldn't shake the feeling that something about the situation was wrong. We both had the same dream, the same house, the same eerie feeling of being watched. How could that even happen? I tried to continue the conversation, but it wasn't the same after that. I kept replaying his words over and over in my head. The rest of the date felt like a blur. I don't even remember what we talked about, or how much time passed. I just wanted it to be over. I felt like I was being pulled into something I couldn't understand. Eventually, I made an excuse to step away and went to the bathroom. I needed a break, something to get my head straight. But when I pulled my phone out of my bag, I couldn't stop myself from scrolling through the messages my friend had sent earlier with his photos. She'd made sure I had them, in case I didn't recognize him when I arrived. I looked at the photos again. and I stared. The guy sitting at the table was not the same person in the pictures. Sure, they had similar features, but the more I looked at them, the more I realized how different they were. His eyes were darker in person, his jawline more pronounced in the photos. Something wasn't adding up, and my heart started pounding in my chest. I could feel the walls closing in. Was this some kind of sick joke? Maybe I was being paranoid, but this didn't feel right. I didn't know who this guy really was, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't who he said he was. When I finally went back to the table, I was a mess. I tried to act normal, to act like everything was fine, but the words he'd said and the way he'd looked at me kept echoing in my mind. I couldn't focus on what he was saying. I was just nodding along, too distracted by what had just happened. But then it happened again. Another woman walked up to the table. She didn't look upset, but there was something off about her presence. She wasn't smiling, but her eyes were locked on him. The words she spoke were calm, but they hit me like a ton of bricks. "That's not who you think it is." She didn't even look at me. She only looked at him, and just like before, he didn't react immediately. He didn't look angry or confused. He just laughed nervously, as though he was used to this kind of thing happening. But I wasn't fooled. My stomach twisted in knots. I didn't stick around to find out more. I had to leave. I had to get out of there. I quickly excused myself, paid my bill, and walked out into the cold night air. I needed space to think, but when I pulled my phone out to message my friend, I saw something that made my blood run cold. I asked her if she had sent me the correct photos. She responded almost immediately, but her text sent me into a spiral of panic. "What photos? I didn't send you anything." I froze, staring at my phone like it might bite me. The pictures she had sent me of the guy I'd just met had been from her. She had specifically made sure I knew what he looked like, but she didn't send them. I tried calling her. No answer. Tried again. Nothing. I didn't know what to think. What had just happened? Now I can't stop thinking about it. Was he stalking me somehow? Was he someone else entirely? Maybe he was part of some elaborate, twisted game. Or worse, maybe I wasn't supposed to have met him at all. I don't know what's going on, but I'll tell you this much. I won't be trusting any blind dates anytime soon.